The sky hasn't been clear in months. It's a bruised, swollen thing now, layered with roiling gray clouds that stretch across what used to be the heartland. Every few hours they rumble, like some living beast rolling in its sleep, waiting to strike again. When they do, the world holds its breath, because each storm carries ice the size of fists, each shard falling fast enough to rip through steel, bone, and what's left of the American dream. This is what's become of the continent, once called the land of promise. Now it's a graveyard of abandoned highways and overturned cars, their windows shattered by the storms that never end. The billboards are still there, ghostly, sun-faded smiles advertising things no one remembers needing. I used to pass them on the road, when traveling still felt like something the living did. Now, each one feels like a tombstone marking another mile closer to oblivion. When the first super-hailstorm hit, people thought it was a freak event. News anchors smiled nervously. Scientists rattled off terms like anomalous microburst and thermal updraft instability. But then came the second, and the third. Soon the storms merged into a seasonal rhythm of destruction, and there were no safe zones left, no coasts, no inland havens, no sanctuaries. Cities folded in on themselves, one after another. The skylines we once admired on postcards are jagged wrecks now, teeth of broken concrete jutting from the earth. Washington, D.C. fell silent after the great whiteout of '39, when hailstones as big as heads pounded the Capitol dome into rubble. Whatever government was left fled underground and then just stopped talking. Maybe they're still out there, buried beneath some bunker, waiting for skies that will never clear. Or maybe the silence means the obvious, that no one's left to issue orders anymore. What remains of civilization is scattered, nomadic, and desperate. Survivor enclaves form around anything that still offers shelter, abandoned malls, subway tunnels, old refineries. Some call themselves communes, others call themselves tribes, but more often they're just fractured bands of the hungry, bound by necessity, mistrust, and the shared illusion that tomorrow might be kinder. Then there are the scavengers. They travel light and strike fast, taking whatever they can from whoever's weaker. They're not villains, just people who ran out of mercy before they ran out of need. In this world, morality erodes like rust on a water tank. You either adapt or you vanish into the static. And the land itself, God, the land, it's unrecognizable. The prairies are gone, buried under sheets of fractured ice and frozen silt. The forests are skeletal, stripped bare by storms that rip bark and branches away like paper. Rivers choke with ice, then thaw into mud, then refreeze again, the cycle never ending. The Midwest, once called the breadbasket, is a wasteland of cratered fields. No crops, no cattle, just the hollow echo of what was once abundance. The cities that tried to survive did so by going downward. Subterranean shelters, converted train tunnels, parking garages, anywhere the sky couldn't reach. But even below ground, the sound of hail pounding above is enough to shake walls loose and remind everyone how small we've become. The old power grid is gone, and the last satellites fell silent 2 winters ago. Now, communication exists in whispers, in flickers of shortwave radio static bouncing off the atmosphere. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll catch a voice, a warning, a lullaby, a reminder that you're not entirely alone in the dark. Most nights I sit by the receiver, pedal the generator, and listen. The sound of the storms carries across the plains like war drums. Every crash is a memory of what we lost, of cities that used to shine, of highways lit by neon and laughter, of fields that grew wheat instead of graves. Sometimes I think I hear music in the distance, an echo from a time when people still believed in songs. The air smells like cold metal and ozone. The ground crunches beneath your boots, even in summer. Each step is a prayer because you never know when the sky will open up and start its assault again. Some say the hail has a pattern, that the storms move east to west in predictable waves. Others say the weather's gone mad, that there's no longer any rhythm to the sky, only wrath. No one argues about the cause anymore. Climate reports, politics, debates, they all feel like relics of a world too arrogant to see its own end coming. The truth is simpler now. The earth has become hostile. The seasons have turned against us. And every day is a reminder that we pushed too far, too fast, and now the sky is collecting its debt. You can still find traces of the old world if you look hard enough. A school bus half buried in ice, a diner's neon sign flickering beneath layers of frost. But they're just reminders, proof that something once lived here, something fragile, something human. And so we wait under a ceiling of thunder, surrounded by ruin, wondering which storm will be our last. My name is Jonah Hale. If you've been listening to the static between stations, the little pulse that appears when everything else goes dark, that's probably me. I used to tell jokes between songs. I used to read the weather and the traffic on the 10 o'clock news. I had a voice that fit perfectly between commercials and lullabies. Now my voice fits where it can. A thin filament threaded through the chaos, pulling at whoever will listen. I won't pretend I'm a hero. I'm ordinary, a man who learned how to fix things because if you don't, you die. Before the storms, I taught high school physics. After the storms, those same lessons became survival manuals. Electricity becomes a promise you can lose overnight, a diode, a prayer. Radio waves, I learned, are stubborn and generous. They travel when roads don't. They carry the small, stubborn fact that other people still exist. Surviving is a series of small, repetitive decisions. I wake when the sky's bruised light leaks into the bunker, pedal the generator for half an hour to charge the batteries, and then climb the ladder to the roof to check the antenna. Hail shreds wires like knife-edge rain. The last time a storm hit, I spent 3 days soldering a feedline under a tarp, while shards of ice hammered the tar like an impatient god. I tie knots that don't slip, tape seams that could be the difference between warmth and a frozen night. And I keep a list, everything I've learned, everything I still need to do, in a small spiral notebook whose pages are gone soft with sweat and weather. People ask me why I keep the transmitter on. Why I cough words into a microphone for a handful of faded batteries and the barely audible hope that someone, somewhere, will answer. The truth is uglier and simpler than grand meaning. When I stop sending my voice into the dark, I stop listening for other voices. And when I stop listening, the last thing that keeps me human, the sense that I am part of a wider conversation, begins to erode. My broadcast is patchwork. Morning transmissions are a list of coordinates and safety tips. If you're moving, avoid Route 7 between mile markers 116 and 121, collapsed overpass and heavy ice. At night, when the world seems lonelier, I read letters salvaged from pack rats, the scrawled notes left behind in a burned-out grocery store, the hand-drawn map a woman traced in pencil when she said she'd lost her husband to a raider called Red. Sometimes I play a song, a single cracked recording of something that might have once been called country or pop, because music holds people like a hand. I'm driven, if anything, by responsibility more than hope. Once, when the storms were still new and the world was simply failing, I found a bundle of cassette tapes in the trunk of a half-buried sedan. On them were the voices of a family, arguing and laughing and promising simple future things, baseball games, birthdays, someone's bad casserole. I listened until the batteries died. Those voices burned into me. They became a ledger I carry. We survived so far not because we were special, but because we kept the promise of ordinary life in our pockets. I keep the radio on to keep that ledger open, to trade the sound of life for the silence that wants to take it. Loss is a constant companion. My sister, Anna, used to be the kind of person who could start a garden with nothing but a prayer and a pocket knife. She tried to farm through the first summer of strange hail and the late frosts that came in May. The year she disappeared, the storms came early and furious. A wall of shattered ice rolled through the valley and rearranged everything. I found her jacket snagged on a fence post and a single boot under a sagging porch. There was no body. There was only the way the wind seemed to carry her name away. People call that kind of thing the new normal. I call it a wound that keeps reopening. There are other losses that don't fit into neat memories. The sound of my daughter's laugh, the tiny staccato she used when she learned to beat a rhythm on the kitchen counter, lives in the grooves of the floorboards. The dog I had, Blue, went the way dogs go when there's nothing left to eat but desperation. I have pictures crammed into a tin box that I keep under the receiver. Sometimes at night, when the storms sound like something alive and angry, I open the box and hold a photograph until the edges blur. It helps, not much, but enough to keep the teeth of sorrow dull for a little while. Survival in the practical sense is about skills and inventory. I have a short list of things I will trade my last can of stew for. Fresh batteries, vacuum tubes, a spool of copper wire, clean water. Water is the axis around which everything spins. I melt what I can from the frayed edges of the world old ice stores, pockets of snow in collapsed basements, and filter it through layers. Cloth, charcoal, sand, and a final boil. I've built a solar still out of a sheet of plastic and an old baking pan. It gives me a liter a day when the sun bothers to show. Food is scavenged carefully. Canned goods from grocery store basements where the doors have frozen half open, roots unearthed beneath collapsed barns, the occasional rabbit snared with a wire snare tied to a bent nail. I ration not because I enjoy it, but because I have learned that the human body is both resilient and merciless. It will adapt to less, but only if you plan. The radio requires its own regimen. The tubes need occasional baking in the heat of a small, controlled fire to remove moisture. Soldering iron tips must be kept clean. My antenna, a tangle of scavenged wire and prayer, must be rerouted when the storms shear away anchor points. I keep a hand-crank transmitter as a backup. It is clunky, archaic, but reliable. You learn late in a broken world that redundancy is a kind of humility. You plan for failure because failure is a guarantee. People come and go. The first ones who found the broadcast were ragged. Some had lost lips to frostbite. Some had hands swollen from frost. We traded stories that first winter, half-truths and good advice. A doctor named Layla taught me how to graft a splint from the remains of a lawn chair. A man called Reed showed me where to find a wrecked UPS battery that would, for a while at least, keep the transmitter on for 3 nights instead of 1. We barter for labor, for companionship, for a memory preserved. But the world chews through alliances as fast as it does through rubber. Trust, in this season, is an investment with no guaranteed return. There are decisions that sit heavy in my chest. Once, a group radioed in a cry for help. A shelter on the east side trapped under ice, generators dying, children coughing. I had enough fuel for one rescue, and the choice of staying put to protect the transmitter or leaving and risking the silence that keeps others alive. I left. We saved 2 children and an old woman who smelled like lemon soap and fear. The transmitter had to run on my hand crank for a month. The signal was thin, the voices fewer. I do not regret it, but every time I pedal the crank and feel my muscles protest, I think about the cost of that choice. Survival asks you to be both generous and cunning. Sometimes those 2 things contradict. There are nights when hope feels like a useless habit. On those nights, I count small things. The number of screws I have left, the pages on my notebook not yet smudged, the cinder block that keeps the door from blowing open. I make tea from dried mint when I find it and pretend I'm somewhere before the storms, a kitchen with sunlight in the morning and the smell of toast. This is not denial. It is rehearsal. If you can remember a life that included softness, you can teach yourself to build softness again. Still, there is stubborn hope, not the naive kind that expects governments to return or factories to hum back to life. This is the thin, practical hope that says, there is another settlement 2 days north that has clean water and a working pump. Someone else heard a humming tower 3 cities over and might have a clue. If I can keep this transmitter alive for another month, I might catch a voice that changes everything. That hope is not sentimental. It's transactional. I tend the antenna, I barter batteries, I heal a broken thigh, and in return I get a sliver of connection that makes the day worth surviving. I speak into the microphone with my voice knuckled raw from cold, with hands that remember 1,000 small repairs. I tell stories because stories are scaffolding. They keep us from collapsing entirely. I read aloud the names of places that mean something, so they don't vanish from language. I announce safe routes and trade times. I tell the truth when I can, lies when the truth would destroy hope without offering any practical advantage. I sign off with the same phrase every night because rituals matter. This is Jonah Hail. You're not alone. Keep your fires low and your hearts lower. It's nonsense grammar, perhaps, but it feels right. When the hail comes, and it always does, sometimes I think about leaving the radio forever. I think about burying my tin of photographs and walking until my legs remember what it feels like to move without the sound of a receiver in my pockets. Then I hear a voice crackle through. A woman reading the names of people she's looking for. A boy laughing at a joke someone told 2 towns over. And I feel both smaller and more convinced that what I do matters. So I keep fixing, keep pedaling, keep speaking. Because amid broken things, a human voice is currency. And as long as I can trade it, I have a reason to live. They warned us about storms. They did not warn us about this. When the first super-hailstorms began, call it the year of the glass, people thought the word super meant spectacular, not apocalyptic. We braced for damage, fixed roofs, stocked dry goods. Then the storms learned to keep coming. They lengthened their seasons. They changed direction. Where there used to be a winter and a summer, we now had a new weather regime that hummed with violence 12 months a year. And the thing that killed our complacency fastest was that the storms grew bigger, meaner, and smarter in ways we couldn't outmaneuver. A super-hailstorm is not one jagged wall of ice. It's an orchestra of physics played at loud volume. It begins with heat, the kind that makes asphalt breathe and rivers think of leaving their banks. Warm air carries moisture, and when that moist air meets a cold pocket high in the atmosphere, the condensation releases heat that makes more air rise. Updrafts form, columns of wind so strong they can hold a fist-sized lump of ice aloft long enough for it to grow another layer. With each loop through the freezing layer, the hailstone accretes more and more. Graupel, rhyme, a new shell, until it becomes a cannonball with wings. When the updraft gives up, what falls is not rain, but a rain made of hard, cold projectiles. We learned the science the way scavengers learn language, from fragments of reports, from a geothermal engineer's notebook passed along in a trade, from radio archives of university lectures that still crackled through like ghosts. This is the crisis I broadcast about every morning and night, in between handing out coordinates and reading aloud names. The storms make everything harder in a dozen small ways that add up to extinction. First, infrastructure. A hailstone the size of your head will punch through most roofing and the glass in most vehicles. A season of those, and whole cities turn into serrated skeletons. Power lines hang like copper intestines, and substations, once guarded hulks of concrete and pride, are now monuments to how fragile our systems were. No electricity means no desalination, no refrigeration, no running pumps at treatment plants. Suddenly, water is not something you turn a tap for. It's a problem you have to solve with physics and patience. Second, supply chains. Trucks don't move when the roads are shredded with ice and gullies. Rail lines warp under repeated hammer blows from above. Food that used to travel in temperature-controlled caravans now rots in uncovered lots or freezes solid, until thaw turns it into a bacterial bloom. The supermarkets that survived the first months are now emptied, and the ones that weren't stripped decades ago. We barter. We dig. We hunt with snares more than guns, because ammunition is a currency that disappears faster than canned peaches. Third, social breakdown. People who once lined up for a loaf now line up to take. As infrastructures crumble, trust fractures. Enclaves rise, often around a resource. A warm spring, a functioning generator, a municipal well with a pump that hasn't yet failed. Some are cooperative and brutal in equal measure. Some are predatory. Raiders, organized bands who move like vultures on a map, learn where to find the weak and the static. Lonely transmitters, isolated farms, radio stations that announce when they'll be most vulnerable. The moral calculus of survival becomes a ledger with only two columns: what you can keep and what you have to give up to sleep. Fourth, medicine and illness. Frostbite and blunt trauma from hail are immediate problems. Deeper is the infection. Cuts turn into sepsis when antibiotics run out. Old diseases that modern medicine kept penned behind needles and pills wake up when refrigeration fails and people travel in crowded, damp tunnels. Pregnant women, the elderly, children, those are the edges that fray first. And then there is water itself. People imagine a hailstorm world as a place with more water, after all, ice, and they're wrong. The water that falls is contaminated. Hail traps whatever particulate and toxic chemical load the atmosphere carries. As industry and climate struggle, the air is heavy with ash and metal and fertilizers stripped from soils and cities. When hail melts, it leaves behind a chemical stew. Rivers become ice-clogged, then poisoned. Aquifers begin to taste of metal. The old systems, treatment plants, chlorination, distribution, are broken or controlled by people who want payment for the privilege of clean water. We melt, filter, boil, distill. Old techniques pressed into service until our hands remember the right ratios. But those methods are slow and low yield. A solar still might give you 1 liter a day under a good sun. That liter has to be rationed across cooking, rinsing, a child's fever. The arithmetic of survival is cruel. On a rainless night 2 winters ago, a convoy of refugees, women, children, a handful of old men, came down the line after hearing my voice. They followed my coordinate calls the way a ship follows a lighthouse. I helped them find shelter. An underground mall turned micro-community with heat from a biodigester. Someone had jury-rigged from food waste and old filters. In return, a woman named Maris, who had once been a chemical engineer before the world started making anything dangerous, taught us how to make activated charcoal from burned wood and coconut husk for better filtering. That barter saved more lives than any radio schedule I'd announced. But there are darker encounters. Raiders who call themselves Red's Hand stalk the highways and the frozen riverbeds. They strike at night, when the hail is lighter and the shadows are longer, taking generators, ropes, the last good tires, and sometimes people who know too much or have something they can't afford to lose. Red, tall, scarred, and rumored to have been a contractor for an energy firm before the world split, doesn't waste bullets on a man with a transmitter. He takes radios because radios connect people. He knows the way we built networks means we are vulnerable where we are connected. He understands leverage. We traded for information on his movements with a can of peaches and a spool of solder. Later that same night, he tried to take our antenna. We lost a man, Reed, bargaining with him at the edge of the mall. He died because we spent reasons like currency and came up short. I still hear him in the hum of my hand crank. Why is survival getting harder each day? Because the system that buffered variability, grids, insurance, governance, logistics, has collapsed into islands, and the shocks that hit those islands are increasing in both frequency and intensity. The atmosphere we live under has more energy. Warmer ocean surfaces feed storms with moisture and heat. The jet stream, a river of wind that used to moderate extremes, twists and halts in patterns that create weather that sits and rages instead of moving along. The result is longer storm seasons, more intense updrafts, and larger hail sizes. In language I piece together from lectures and ragged academics, we trade with increased atmospheric moisture plus greater instability equals more hail growth. When the jet stream stalls, the same region can be pounded again and again, and the cumulative damage is exponential, not linear. Our resources dwindle in painful, bureaucratic ways. Fuel is not just gasoline. It's the difference between boiling water and drinking poison. When fuel is scarce, we lose the means to sterilize. We lose the ability to run generators for the radios we depend on. We lose heat. So we ration. Who gets a liter of diesel for the generator and who doesn't? Those conversations rip communities apart. Food is a similar calculus. One family trades 2 tins of beans for a fox pelt to keep a child warm. Another gives up a heater coil in exchange for a spare battery to keep a medical freezer running for a woman with insulin. You learn to prioritize. You learn that the most urgent need is the one the child has now, not the one promised for later. Practical advice becomes the currency of connection. On the air, I read those things like scripture because, in this world, they are. Reinforce roofs with sheets of plywood and sports equipment, helmets, old tires, tied down under tarps. They break up the momentum of hail before it reaches a brittle roof. Create a double-layer window system with an outer removable shield, plywood or salvaged metal, so that on warning you can close the outer layer and keep the fragile inner glass intact. Build a snow and hail shed for vehicles, an A-frame that cuts the vertical blast of falling ice, and park vehicles so their strongest structural axis faces the prevailing storm direction. In tunnels and subterranean shelters, clear drainage points constantly. Ice will dam where you least expect it, and a small flood underground can suffocate 100 people who thought they were safe. Medical procedures are simple and grim. Treat blunt trauma by immobilizing with splints and making sure bleeding is controlled. Clean every cut with a boiled saline solution and dress with sterile materials, because infection is the real killer. If frostbite starts pale, hard, numb tissue, don't rub it with snow. Warm gently and get the limb to a steady heat source. If there's suspicion of infection, redness, swelling, fever, antibiotics must be used early and decisively. We trade antibiotics like rations because they save lives fast, but they're finite. Vaccines that used to be routine, gone for many. A child's cough that used to be nothing can now spiral. We teach the basics. Keep wounds clean, isolate infected people when possible. Use honey and cloth compresses if you have no antiseptics. And always watch for signs of systemic infection. There is also science that others don't talk about on the air, the kind that's brutal to mention, feedback loops. The more ice we break and refreeze and then compact into scars on the land, the more reflective surface we alter. The albedo, how much sunlight the ground bounces back, changes, which affects local climate. Drought and heat in some regions feed storms elsewhere. Cities produce heat islands that exacerbate convective processes. Put simply, our attempts to adapt, using diesel heaters, for example, sometimes add to the very energy imbalance making storms worse. No one wants to hear that the solution might be making immediate sacrifices that hurt us now for the sake of an uncertain future. So we improvise, and the planet improvises too, and the result is a harder life. The human stories are messy. I've radioed warnings to a convoy that then drove straight into a storm because the other option, staying at a known raider road, felt worse. I've watched people make moral calculus in half hours. Give away your last water to a stranger and risk your family, or refuse and live knowing a child died because you kept your ration. Those are decisions without a right answer. They are calcified into me. They change the contours of who we become. And yet, amidst the rubble, there are inventions. We patch together desalination rigs from truck radiators, pull heat from compost piles to warm greenhouses, and graft solar panels into arrays that can be packed and moved. Communities that learn to work together, share maintenance schedules, stockpile resources collectively, rotate guard duty, survive longer. Those are the lessons I keep repeating on the air. Redundancy, sharing, and knowledge. We cannot rebuild whole factories, but we can rebuild networks of trust. And in a world of super-hailstorms, networks are as important as walls. Tonight, a new front forms on the radar, an amber smear on the soup-tup weather scans we still get from old government buoys. It's set to cross 2 states in less than a day, and the models, such as they are, suggest updrafts strong enough to grow stones the size of newborns. We have to move people. We have to reinforce shelters. We need the spare battery Reed promised before he died. We have one hand crank and 2 hours of daylight left. This is the crisis. A sky that fights back with solid hands, a world with fewer buffers, and a human population that is learning harshly how to live in the margins. Every time I key the mic, I am threading a rope between islands of people. Some nights the rope holds. Some nights it frays. But we keep throwing it anyway, because without connection the numbers on a ledger turn into anonymous statistics. More lost, more gone. We are not statistics, not when we can hear each other's voices. Not yet. So I make my lists, pack my satchel, check the soldering iron, and read the coordinates into the night. I tell the people where to go, how to plug a leak, how to keep a baby warm. I tell the truth I can stomach and hide the parts that would only break a heart without fixing anything. And as the sky prepares to throw its next fist, I hold the mic steady and the antenna higher, because the air between us is the only map we have left. The sky learned a new trick that spring. The hail stopped falling in the neat sheets we'd grown used to and started arriving in waves. A long, slow drum roll that swelled and then crashed, shaking the bones of the city as if someone above were testing the metal of the world. It would start with a whisper, subtle at first, a distant metallic pitter that made the water in the cistern sing. Then, over hours, it grew teeth. By the time it hit, the sound wasn't rain at all but artillery, a metal rain that bent awnings like paper and sent shards ricocheting down alleyways. We measured danger now not in news cycles but in supplies. I kept lists like a priest kept rosaries. Batteries, cans of beans, coils of copper wire, aspirin, antifreeze, a single pack of insulin for a woman named Rosa who once ran a bakery and now ran the food line. The numbers on the list shrank no matter how careful we were. A battery went to a radio that needed it. The generator needed diesel. Diesel was a currency. Food was a direct arithmetic of mouths and days. Even fuel had become moral calculus. Run the heater to keep a family alive through the night, or save it for the morning when someone might need the truck to haul a wounded man to the underground clinic. The mall community we sheltered in had walls lined with the things the old world tossed away. Mannequins frozen mid-pose, racks of clothes stiff with cold, carousel horses with chipped paint. We had made it home in a kind of scavenged dignity. It was not safe in any absolute sense, but it was predictable in ways the outside world no longer was. Predictability was a kind of refuge. Then the raids started getting bolder. Red's hand had learned our rhythms. They watched the generator cycles, noted supply runs, and hit when the light was low. The first time they came, they circled like crows and took the rooftop solar panels before anyone knew what had happened. The second time they used hammers and a coordinated rush. They took our spare tires, the antenna feed line, and 3 women who'd gone out to barter for medical gauze. We tried to talk to them. They laughed and left a stitched rag nailed to the door with the word "account" scrawled in black ink. The word was a promise and a ledger in equal measure. Defense became improvisation. We set up rotas. 2 men on the tower with bolt cutters and spray paint shields. A watch rotating every hour through the long, murderous night. Ropes draped like trip lines across the mall's entrances that would tangle and slow a looter's foot. We dug a shallow trench and lined it with rusted rebar to create a blast fence for the vehicles, not to stop a hailstorm, but to limit where a raider could park and force them to show themselves. We practiced with slings and traps. We taught the kids to use mirrors to flash signals across the parking lot. It was primitive and sometimes ugly, but it bought us seconds, and seconds make a difference. The human costs mounted. Reed's absence was a hollow that shifted the group's center of gravity. He'd been blunt and practical, a man whose hands had known the shape of a battery pack and the weight of a promise. He died bargaining for a spool of solder. And the space he left was not just missing muscle, but missing a kind of courage that came with readiness to bear pain for others. People argued after his death about how Reed had died and whether it could have been prevented. Those arguments were quiet knives. Trust frayed in other, sneakier ways. You learn in a broken world that people come with edges you can't always see. A supply convoy takes a risk every mile. Will the driver be an honest man with a mental ledger or a thief with a plan? We had a man, Jonas, who traded an extra ration of canned peaches for a vial of painkillers and then disappeared. Weeks later, a woman came through with a thin-lipped map and a story of how Jonas had joined a road gang that hoards fuel and kills for the right size of a battery. We thought Jonas might be dead. The idea that he'd betrayed us for a can of peaches felt like a puncture wound. And then the voice came. It was faint at first, a pattern in the static I almost missed, a half-second pulse between other transmissions, a signature I'd heard in the recordings Mari's used to send when she wanted help. It was a trio of frequencies stacked with a low hum, what someone with more time and better equipment might call a beacon. The voice that rode the beacon called itself Hearthwell. The first message was a fragment. Working pump, clean water, 18 kilometers north, coordinates on the board, only for cooperating groups, no weapons on approach. For days I let the fragment sit like a rumor between my molars. In the mall, people murmured and spat out the name like a promise. Hearthwell sounded like so many things we'd been taught not to trust. Another myth, a distant dream, a name given to something so good it couldn't be true. But names have gravity. Even a whisper of reliable water draws bodies like a tide. The question that followed was old and heavy. Was it real or a trap? We had seen traps before. Raider gangs used false slogans, fake flags of supply convoys, staged children crying for help to lure decent people onto frozen ground where someone waited with hatred. We had also seen miracles, a dig under an old municipal plant that produced a pump still connected to a municipal aquifer, a community of farmers who had somehow kept greenhouses alive under compost heat and insulated glass. The world had become a ledger of both saints and devils. Inside me, the decision tore at different seams. I still had the transistor and the antenna and the duty to keep the transmission going. The radio was not vanity. It was a line to others. If I left now to join a caravan, who would keep the air alive? But if Hearthwell was real and we could secure the pump and a safe route, that one infrastructure could shift the entire region's economics. With steady water, infirmaries flourish, gardens become possible, trade centers reestablish. Water had the power to rebuild the possibility of a future. Staying with the radio might mean preserving connection. Going north might mean saving lives now. The debate made a nest in the mall's community hall. Mari's argued for verification missions, small, stealthy scouts with minimal signatures. Layla wanted to send a medical team and check the coordinates for contaminants. Rosa, whose son's fever trembled in the corner, wanted to go now. How many more children have to cough to death while we debate? She asked. And no one could answer because the math crawled across the skin like frostbite. We prepared contingencies. I bolstered the transmitter's power supply with a salvaged UPS read once showed me. I trained 2 young women, Tess and Nora, on how to tune the hand crank and bake tubes with a small hot plate. I drew maps and circled alternate routes, the ones less likely to be watched by Red's hand. Creek beds and shadowed lowlands where a convoy could slip beneath a watchful eye. We packed light, each man and woman carrying a canteen, a bandage roll, a few tins, a roll of copper wire and tools. We negotiated with a neighboring enclave for a pair of pack mules in exchange for a set of school books and a jar of honey. On the morning the scouts left, the world was brittle. Hail had fallen in curtains that left silver crusts on the cars like armor. We watched them go. 5 people, 2 mules, a sputtering truck with an ice-stitched tarp. I keyed the mic every hour with updates. Scouts north, last seen at mile marker 15, I said, my voice steady with a radio operator's cadence. The radio made me useful in a way that felt sacred. Usefulness keeps grief from expanding. They found something. The first message back was short and punctured with breath. Hearthwell, pump intact, diesel reserve minimal, guarded perimeter. No firearms, barter for maintenance, clean water, bring filters, bring charcoal. Relief pressed the community's faces into folds. For a few hours, hope made us larger. Then the other messages arrived. Hearthwell was not a neutral utility. It was a project run by a group that called themselves the Covenant, people who had once been municipal workers, then conservatives, then protectors, then enforcers. They had not rebuilt democracy. They had built a bureaucracy with teeth. They demanded labor in exchange for water. They asked for a tithe in the form of skilled workers, mechanics, radio technicians, and people who could teach irrigation. They wanted guarantees that the communities they supplied would not harbor raiders or anyone affiliated with Red. Their language was careful and barbed. Cooperation had teeth. Cooperation is easy to sign if you have nothing to lose. It is harder when cooperation requires handing over a person with a past or refusing a neighbor who needs a ration. A woman named Mara, once the head of the mall's kitchen, had a brother rumored to have worked with Red in a different era. The Covenant said no affiliates. Mara's eyes hollowed in a way that made everyone look away. When the final list came back, Mara was not on it. The community split. One part argued that a structured partner with a pump and engineering skill was a miracle we couldn't refuse. Another said we would trade freedom for water and lose the little dignity we had left. The tension bubbled into violence when Red's hand tried to move. They hit a caravan returning from an outpost that had managed to dry and preserve corn. The ambush was precise, and they took the truck and a woman named Alois. We mounted a counterwatch. Tess and Nora stayed awake for 30 hours, monitors under their arms rubbing at eyes swollen with caffeine and cold. We made traps more lethal, less to kill than to maim and drive away. The raiders became bolder in response, and the line between defense and offense blurred. Inside me, the old nightmares reanimated. The memory of Reed bartering his life away had a different echo now. I replayed every decision like a film strip with burned frames. Leave the transmitter, lose the capability to be a node. Take the convoy, risk the entire mall if the raiders learn our route. The moral equations multiplied until I could feel them in my teeth. At night, I dreamt of water as a living thing, a slow creature that moved through pipes and under floors, creaked through joints, and made the whole world softer when it passed. In the dream, it paused at a valve labeled Hearthwell and waited as if to see who would open it. I woke and wrote the dream down. Dreams are a kind of data in a world that loves numbers. The requirement from the Covenant, that we vet and exclude affiliates, forced the community into an ugly choice. We compromised. We would send 2 representatives to Hearthwell for inspection and training. We would offer a rotation of labor, and we would keep our borders open but on the Covenant's schedule. We would not, the agreement read in stiff hand, harbor those on the Covenant's blacklist. It was not the whole answer we wanted. It was a compromise with teeth, but it was water. The night before the first rotation left, a stranger came to the transmitter. She called herself Eve. Her hands were bandaged, her voice a low rasp. She said her husband had been taken by Red's hand, and that she had information about their caches, and about a secondary pump to the east, one not on the Covenant's maps. They take and claim, she told me in the rusted interior of the mall's food court. Hearthwell holds water and they hold people. Red wants both. She offered the location of a satellite fuel depot and a map of tracks where Red's hand had been seen. In exchange, she wanted shelter and a guarantee that her husband would be looked for. Trusting Eve felt like laying down a warm stone across a frozen pond. It might be a viable step, or it might trigger a crack, but living without trust had its slow rot. You stop sharing, stop collaborating, and the cooperative innovations that keep life going die like flowers in a neglected pot. I kept Eve's secret. 2 men, Tess's brother and a quiet locksmith named Harlan, took the map and went out under moonlight to look for the depot. They came back with a half-broken can of diesel and a thin smile. The diesel smelled like salvation. As we prepared to leave for Hearthwell, rotations, filters, a promise of shared labor, We fortified the mall. We trained people to run the transmitter in my absence. I taught Nora how to solder a feed line and Tess how to discipline a frequency. We buried the photographs in a tin behind the generator, not because they were precious, they were, but because they were inconvenient in a world built on loss, and thus must be hidden. And then the storm arrived early. It came from the west, a wall of black cloud with a liveried roar. The hail hit like a thrown net of knives. For a day and a half, the world outside became a single, giant percussion instrument. The mall's roof shuddered. Our trenches filled and froze and then cracked. We lost 2 rooftop windows. A section of the parking lot collapsed where runoff had undermined the soil. During a lull, Red's hand moved. They attacked the mall in the gray hour when the hail was lessened and visibility thinned. We met them with chains, with traps, and with an oral pact to protect each other. The fight was a muddle of shouting, broken plastic, the smell of burning rubber and coffee. We lost stockpiles. We lost a person, Mara's brother, who we tried to hide but who stepped into the light to buy time and paid with his breath. In the morning, after the raiders fled and the storm had torn itself ragged, Tess found a small device among the debris. A beacon, similar to the one Harthwell used but crude and stamped with Red's mark. Red had tried to mimic the symbol to lure scouts. The knowledge cut like ice. Harthwell might be real, but the radio landscape was now adulterated with lies. Signals could be traps. Trust was not only fragile between people, it could be weaponized in our airspace. The choice had become clear in the way we were forced to act. Verification had to be kinetic and redundant. We would not send a single convoy. We would send multiple small teams on staggered routes with coded phrases that only we would recognize. We would not travel with obvious loads. Instead, traders disguised as pilgrims would carry small filters and a letter from Mari's. We would share our tracks, intentionally misleading at times, to confound any gangs listening to the air. We tightened the transmitter's schedule and encoded our own replies with a 2-tone chime that Eve had taught me in a whisper, a pattern that mimicked a child's laugh to the untrained ear, and that was unmistakable to us. And still the urgency sat in my chest as if it were a small living thing. Water, the practical hope, hummed like a magnet. Harthwell's promise, real, fake, or halfway, blew through the hallway like the smell of wet earth after rain. It made us plan, argue, pray, and arm ourselves for a future that might arrive with a pump and a debt. I sat at the transmitter more these days, my hands scarred from soldering, my voice hoarse. I read coordinates and warnings and sometimes the names of people we'd lost in the last wave. Names keep the world human. Between the overhead crash of broken ice and the thin music of distant voices, I measured fear and courage in 2 columns, what we risked and what we could gain. The ledger looked messy, the entries blurred, but the last line I wrote in my notebook before the first teams left read like a benediction. If we don't try, we know the answer. No pump, no water. If we try, we either find water or we learn something new. So we tried. We loaded the wagons with filters, with spare tubes, with a hand crank no one wanted to carry, but that everyone knew how to use. We set the matches and the ropes and the plans. We kissed for courage and said goodbyes in a voice like an old hymn. The mall watched them go. The transmitter hummed. I keyed the mic and sent them out with the same line I kept for myself. This is Jonah Hale. You're not alone. Keep your fires low and your hearts lower. The words sounded smaller in the aftermath of the storm, but they carried weight. They were a rope thrown across a chasm. The rising action was not a single event, but a collection of sharp moments strung together like beads. Shortages that bit more, raids that learned our rhythms, a rumor that promised salvation, a stranger who offered an overlay of truth mixed with danger. Each choice split into more choices. Each choice felt heavy enough to collapse a person if carried too long. Now we waited again, for reports, for returns, for the sound of a pump turning over in the dark, for a raider's whistle that would mean trouble. The weather map still burned amber on the old buoy feed. The next storm would come. The next decision would be harder. Hope had converted into plans and contingency and bartering for time. The question that pressed at the base of every breath was the oldest in our small, veneered world. Who do we become when the sky keeps pressing its palm against our faces? I tuned the dial and listened. Somewhere in the static, someone laughed, and for that thin second I could imagine a place called Hearthwell where water ran and children learned songs again. Then the signal fell into noise, and I had to set the anchor for the community I still had. The orders were simple: reinforce the doors, rotate the watchers, and send no one alone. The teams left at dawn with a map and a vow. The rising action had done its job. It had pushed us to act, to fracture, and to reassemble in ways that would either build us up or tear us apart. We were a community poised on an edge, with a myth that smelled of water and a sky that still struck like a fist. The next step would be bigger than any of us. The radio waited. The road waited. The pump, if it existed, waited. And I kept the mic warm because in these days the sound of human voice is ballast. The road into Hearthwell looked like a scar. We picked our way through frozen ruts and ragged drift, remnants of hailstorms that had gouged the earth raw, and the mall's convoy narrowed to a single file as we crept beneath the dim, bruised sky. For a moment, all of it felt unreal. The hush of people watching from behind makeshift curtains, the dear silent way communities paused to listen. Even the air felt like a held breath. Hearthwell sat inside the ruin of an old water treatment plant. Tanks scarred with rust, catwalks canted like tired ribs, the skeletal remains of a chlorination tower that someone had repurposed into a lookout. The place smelled faintly of oil and lemon disinfectant, the odd smells of a civic body that had been made human again. They had piled tires against gaps, welded plates where stone had crumbled, and stretched tarps like flags along the perimeter. Men and women in patched navy jumpers, uniforms that read like municipal ghosts, manned the gates. They carried the posture of people who had learned order the hard way. A woman met us at the gate. She was not young and not soft. Her hair was clipped short and pale like frost. "I am Miriam," she said, and her voice had the practiced calm of someone who made rules because rules kept people alive. "We are the Covenant. We keep Hearthwell. Water is life. Water is not free." Her terms were not cruelty by accident. They were a political design. Maintenance labor, sanitation rotas, and a small tithe every month. No weapons. Vetting on arrival. No affiliates of known raider groups. We had expected those words. We had been bargaining in the margins of dignity for months. But between hearing a term and living one, a distance opens. They showed us the pump. A squat, muscular thing bolted to a concrete pad, paired with a diesel generator that purred like a content beast. Pipes like healed veins ran from the pump into a line of insulated tanks. Beside the pump, stacked in neat rows, were sealed drums of diesel, a bank of filters, and a crate of ceramic membranes. It was the sort of infrastructure that felt unreal because we hadn't touched running municipal equipment in years. Here, by some design and stubbornness, it lived. Miriam, practical and unblinking, walked us through the constraints. The pump needed clean diesel and a functioning governor. The filter bank would need activated charcoal and repeated backwash cycles to keep the organics from fouling. If started properly, the system could feed a ring of cisterns for a dozen communities for weeks. If started improperly, it would shear bearings, blow seals, and all that promise would be an oily, wasted dream. Outside on the low horizon, a wall of cloud was growing. The old buoy feeds we still got, hand-me-down from university labs and old NOAA caches, painted it amber. A convective shelf with the kind of updraft profile that made hailstones grow fat and mean. The sky had a look I had learned to read, greed in the clouds. We had hours, maybe. That was enough to make urgency a kind of pressure in our throats. Then the scout's voice broke in on my headset. "Tracks, many, Red's hand. Bearing north by northeast. They're moving fast. They've got rigged beacons. They're listening." Red's hand had used radios as weapons before. They mimicked beacons to lure convoys into crossfires. They used transmission windows to time ambushes, and they controlled territory by controlling the airways, by making sure the static spelled death. I looked at Miriam, who had not flinched at the mention, and for a second I saw the calculation run behind her eyes. Keep the pump, protect the water, secure the perimeter, but at what human cost? The choice we faced was a crystalline cruelty. We could keep the transmitter on, keep the network alive and possibly call for help if Red hit us, and risk giving the raiders an exact vector to our party and to the pump. Or we could go dark, cut the signal and pour fuel into the pump, starting a machine that would feed hundreds, but in doing so we'd go silent, cutting off the lifeline people elsewhere depended on. Either choice killed something: trust, possibility, or connection. I thought of Reed, how he'd smiled like a man who kept promises the way others kept coats, and of the 2 children we'd saved, and of the grandmother with the lemon-scented hands. I thought of Anna's jacket on a fence post and the way wind took names away. There is no theatrics in making a choice like that. There is a ledger. On one side, the lives you might save by starting a pump now. On the other, the network you might sever by going silent. The ledger is heavy. Keep the air quiet, Mara said, her voice thin with grief and anger, and get that pump on. We don't have the time for ceremonies. Rosa, who had a child with fever in her arms, stared at me. If water runs tonight, my boy survives. My hands were steady when I answered, but my heart knocked like a fist. We go dark for 5 minutes, I said. We'll run a false beacon to draw any ears away, and then we cut everything and power the pump. The generator here can take the load. I'll give them a pulse on the North Channel, something loud that says conv, and then we go silent. If Red focuses on that, they might move away. Nora, my steward for the transmitter, grabbed my arm. Her fingers were small and hot with adrenaline, and if they move toward it, then we don't run blind, I said. We route 2 teams to cross their path. We make sure they're not between the pump and the tanks when it starts. We buy the pump time. It was a bad plan dressed in the best of intentions, our kind of plan, but it was a plan. We had hours, but the sky was already sharpening its teeth. I keyed the mic with a tone I had practiced. A chime, then the cadence of a fake convoy warning, the sort of honest-sounding gibberish that a real convoy would broadcast to indicate their ETA. The beacon I fed into the net was loud and obvious, an invitation with the smell of travel in it. I saw Miriam's jaw tighten and then nod. Nora breathed out like someone who had been holding the sea in her hands. They took the bait. I watched the ripples through the static like watching a pond. The raiders took the sound and began to move toward it. Red's vans would drive the frozen riverbeds, where the ice made for quick miles and quick ambushes. They were predictable in their cunning. We had hoped their predictability would be our advantage. Then the sky opened its fist. The hail came in a slab turned vertical, drums of ice revolving down and shredding anything soft. It hit the outer perimeter before we finished the startup sequence. The diesel generator coughed, spat, and then took a savage groan as Miriam's crew engaged it. Sparks jumped. A belt snapped. A warning light blinked red. Someone shouted in a language born of fear and oil. Red's hand hit in the same hour, shadows moving like knives through the fields. I expected carnage, the smell of gunpowder and iron. What we got was messy, human, and terrible. Red's men were not all masked demons. Some were tired, too, hungry like wolves. Shotguns cracked in the parking lot. Someone shouted the wrong name and was taken in the confusion. Harlan, never a man of words, stepped into a beam of ice-lit night to pull a trapped driver from a vehicle and took a slug that would not let him walk again. He died on my shoulder, warm and swearing, and in those dying breaths asked me to make sure the pump kept running. The pump was a temperamental animal. The governor had a stutter. The feed needed a shim. A rusty valve had to be freed with heat, and the turn of a key that only someone with calloused hands could manage. I found myself elbow-deep in oil and cold, fingers numb, thinking in the spare, utilitarian math that had kept me alive since the world turned mean. Torque here, pressure there, Don't exceed the RPM, watch the feed. Operation is not a miracle, it's the precise application of muscle and knowledge. The Covenant's technicians worked like monks, precise, patient, sacred. We got it going. The pump coughed, whined, and then, as if it had been waiting centuries to do something useful, it took hold. Water moved from the buried aquifer through the pipe, through the filters into tanks. It sang like a small church bell. People cried. Children ran to the edges of the cisterns with tin cups. For a moment, the world reduced to water and the people who drank it. I did not have time to savor that joy. Red's men circled like they'd come for trophies, and a hailstorm ripped through the sky with a bad temper. The Covenant's men and ours fought side by side in that moment, not because we'd suddenly become friends, but because everyone had the same short-term interest: keep the pump running. We barricaded filter heads with tarps, replaced belts torn by flying grit, and used our bodies as shields over tender pipe joints as hail pummeled us into bent shapes. I bled into the mud that day, and every drop was a kind of punctuation. Harlan's blood made the oil slick look like a dirty sunset. Reed's absence felt like an accusation and a benediction at the same time. If anything in me changed, it was less a conversion than a soft, terrible acceptance. I would trade the transmission if it meant more cups filled tonight. I would let the network go dark when the alternative was letting a child die of thirst. Later, when the guns stilled and the hail ebbed like tide, we counted losses and victories. We had lost stockpiles and a man named Mara's brother, but we had gained something larger and more awkward: a functioning pump. Miriam's face had hardened into a new softness as she watched a child suck water from tin-fingered cups. The Covenant signed an agreement then and there: less paperwork, more awkward handshakes, that they would share water with a ring of communities and would open training sessions in exchange for labor and maintenance. They did not become saints overnight. They held conditions and rumors and hard edges. But the pump ran. I walked back to the transmitter site in the hollow hour after the storm, when the world smelled of crushed ice and diesel, and found Nora sitting by the ruined microphone, hands raw. The antenna lay like a bent spine against the sky. Red's men had shot the junction box to pieces. We were, in the technical sense, offline. I felt a small and ancient grief in my chest. The sound of my voice had been severed from the network by a choice that saved more mouths than it silenced. For a long minute I sat with that and let it be what it was: a wound that did not want to pretend it was a miracle. Then a child from the Covenant came running, laughing in a rough, surprised way, clapping her small hands. "Water!" she shouted, and the laugh was a sound that did not belong to us any more than the pump did, but for reasons the heart understands, it belonged to everyone. I thought of Anna's jacket and the way the wind stole names. I thought of Reed and Harlan and all the ledger entries that had been paid in quiet, small currencies. I thought of every broadcast I had ever made and every one I hadn't. You cannot save everyone. You can only choose the shape of the world you leave for the living. I had chosen to trade signal for sustainment, voice for water. It was not a heroic ledger. It was a human one. That night, around the new cistern, people passed cups and sang songs they half remembered and half made up. The Covenant taught us how to reroute power to a backup grid. We showed them how to listen for beacons that mimicked children's laughs. We learned, we bartered. We healed the worst wounds we could. The transmitter was broken, but the pump ran. On my notebook's last line before sleep took me, I wrote a sentence small and unfinished. We are a network even when the wires go dark. We are a promise even when the voice is gone. It felt like both a prayer and a plan. The sky would come again. Red would slither like a shadow. The world would keep demanding violent arithmetic. But for the first time in a long while, when I closed my eyes, I could imagine a morning that smelled like warm bread and clean water. It was not a fix to the planet's debts. It was not redemption. It was simply water and the knowledge that we had chosen, in a moment of thunder and pain, to be the kind of people who keep the pumps running for others. The morning after the pump took hold, The world felt both larger and more brittle. Water was running in barrels and in new, cautious pipes. Children splashed in tin basins and then were shushed because we could not waste what we had. The pumps hummed a tired hymn under the clatter of the mall's generator and the Covenant's diesel beast, an ugly, necessary sound that made people stand straighter. For the first time in a long while, someone could take a cup of clean water without looking like a person stealing. My decision to go dark and put the pump first did not erase anything. It cut a thread and tied another. Out there, on roads I could not see and through towns that depended on my nightly voice, people were left without the small comfort of connection. I know at least one group took heavier losses in the hours we were silent. A convoy hit a hidden ice crest, rolled, and a family's youngest died when help didn't come. I carry their faces. The ledger of choices never balances itself perfectly. On the other side of that ledger, dozens of lives were steadied. Layla reopened a small clinic beside Harthwell's intake tanks. She can now clean wounds and boil instruments without rationing every drop. Rosa's son's fever broke after 3 days of cool, clean water and careful medicine. We started rotating water deliveries to nearby enclaves, 1 barrel at a time, until small cisterns filled and mothers could wash their children and not feel like water thieves. Those were real wins. They were also tiny and expensive. The Covenant proved to be what we had feared and expected. Less Eden, more institution. Miriam and her lieutenants were pragmatic. They demanded schedules, rosters, and records because record-keeping is the backbone of long-term survival. They insisted on maintenance logs, training seminars, and a rule set that read like municipal code. Sanitation protocols, ration thresholds, a labor rotation for filter and generator upkeep. They were strict about affiliates. They booted anyone with proven links to Red's hand. That rule broke our community in ways we are still mending. Mara's brother remained missing, and the absence was a raw, private wound. Still, the Covenant taught us things. They taught us backwashing schedules that doubled filter life, how to vent the diesel tank to reduce sulfidic rot, and how to anneal a brittle pipe joint using a small forge and a steady hand. They showed us how to run a proper chlorination cycle, small doses, careful monitoring, so the water tasted less like a chemical warning and more like something that washed away dust without leaving a memory of poison. In exchange, we taught them how to listen, to read the human signals that hide in static, and to recognize a staged beacon when they heard one. There was a pragmatic humility in our barter. Neither side left the other unmarked. On the ground, life resumed in measurements rather than miracles. We planted a line of insulated cold frames near the treatment tanks, an improvised greenhouse heated by the waste heat of the generator and compost piles. The first radishes came out crooked and small, but they were real and bright, and people dropped them into soup as if they were jewels. We started a small seed bank, radish, turnip, barley. The bread we made was thin and dense, but when we ate it with thinning soup, it tasted like a future that might be constructed in increments. Yet the environment made no promises. The storms came in lesser, crueler bursts. Heat waves that bucked the seasons still slammed the coasts, and the jet stream continued to wander in erratic loops, dumping energy into local convective systems and making hail size and frequency spike in unpredictable places. The pump did not change that. It merely gave us an infrastructure to help survive more storms. The feedback loops I'd learned about before the world got meaner were still active. Our diesel use, our makeshift repairs, the clearing of wood for improvised heating. These small actions continued to affect the localized balance. We tried to offset when we could. Harthwell's engineers began experiments with biodigester fuel built from food waste and humanure to reduce diesel draw. The yield was imperfect, but it was a beginning. Red's hand did not disappear. They changed tactics. The raid on the mall had been costly and messy for them. The pump was not an easy trophy. They shifted from frontal assaults to subterfuge, stealing small caches of fuel, bribing fence-sitters, and setting false beacons in remote paths to siphon away those who sought help. We adapted too. We planted false trails and false rumors when we wanted to divert attention. We ran decoy beacons that screamed like a broken car in the night. We trained couriers, people who would move on foot between enclaves carrying encoded messages and small filters. We rebuilt a human network, slow, physical, and stubborn, because the air had been compromised. For my part, the choice to trade the main transmitter for the pump reshaped what I was able to do. I became less of a nightly voice and more of a coordinator on the ground, a sort of field liaison between Hearthwell, our mall, and other enclaves. We scavenged parts for a hand-cranked transmitter and taught 3 people how to run it. Those devices are crude and slow, but they're harder to triangulate from a distance and easier to hide in a rucksack. We also established fixed hours where brief, coded bursts, no more than a minute, would be allowed so we could keep some airways open without painting a target on our backs. It was imperfect, but it was something. There were quieter changes inside me that had nothing to do with logistics. I had begun in this world as someone who maintained the air because it kept me anchored to a broader humanity. I thought of the radio as a tether. The life of the network mattered as an abstract good. After the pump, that abstraction became flesh. Watching a child take a clean breath after days of coughing is not an abstraction. It is a fact that sits in your chest and reshapes what you are willing to do. That morning at the valves, hands in grease and cold, I learned to count people in a new calculus. Numbers in my notebook were no longer signal metrics. They were cups and thighs and names. Grief, however, remained. People still died. Harlan's space at the workbench never warmed again. Reed remained a story told in low voices. Mara's family was incomplete, and that quiet hung in doorways. I found myself apologizing silently to the radio when I tuned it, as if a machine could forgive me for going silent. I apologized to the faces of those who had died when help didn't come fast enough. I learned that apology is sometimes the only currency you can give when nothing else will do. Community dynamics shifted under new pressures and new wealth. Water is wealth now. Small power structures formed that felt uncomfortably like the old ones. The Covenant's governance could become compassionate or oppressive, depending on who held authority on a given day. Miriam was stern but not cruel. Her deputy, a man named Calder, had a habit of trusting paperwork over people, and sometimes let forms override mercy. We fought those bureaucratic edges because we had to. A community that replaces one kind of oppression with another has not escaped the old world. It has merely dressed it in a different coat. Amidst the bureaucratic compromises, small human things returned that made the nights less bitter. Children learned to sing a new song that mixed old choruses with made-up verses about pumps and light. We had storytelling nights again, where people who had once been mute with grief told ridiculous tales about the world before. Traffic jams, summer fairs, the taste of mangoes. Those stories were not nostalgia so much as rehearsal. If we can remember what used to be true, maybe we can graft pieces of it onto what we have now. And there was work, constant, unglamorous, and necessary. Filters had to be cleaned. Valves had to be checked for hairline fractures. Belts had to be monitored for fraying. We built redundancy into everything we could. 2 spare governors for the pump, a secondary line of ceramic membranes hidden in a buried crate, an emergency protocol to vaporize diesel and keep the intake warm during hard freezes. The work became a kind of religion, liturgy of grease and patience. I often walked the path between the mall and Hearthwell, a ribbon of compacted earth I helped lay with others. In the damp air after a short hail, I would run my hand along the pipe and feel it warm from the water moving inside as if the infrastructure itself were alive. The sight of people carrying small jerry cans home for their families made me both exhausted and stubbornly hopeful. It is easy to mistake survival for thriving, but I knew the difference. We had not reversed the climate or unbent the sky. We had found a way to make a place livable for a ring of people, and that is not nothing. Before I used to sign off with the same line on the radio every night. The transmitter's silence had made that line a promise I could not keep the same way. So I changed the ritual. At the pump each evening we gathered at dusk, and I read aloud the names of those we'd lost in the last storm, then the names of those newly found. We lit a wick and passed the cup of water. It was not a broadcast to many. It was a ceremony for us. I still whisper into a battered hand crank sometimes when I think the air might carry it, because voice matters even when it cannot be heard far away. If you ask me now whether things have improved, I will tell you this. They have, in small, crucial ways. Children are less likely to die of dehydration in our ring of communities. We have clean water for clinics and for seed germination. We have new skills and new trade relationships. We have neighbors who, though wary and scarred, will spare a ration if you are the last person with a newborn. But the larger climate, the shifting jet stream, the energy trapped in the seas, the feedback loops of our own desperate adaptations, remains a relentless fact. We are not out of debt with the planet. We have only learned to make smaller payments. My name still matters to a handful of people. I am not the voice on every night, and I do not pretend otherwise. I am a man who traded signal for cups of water and lives with the small, terrible math of that choice. I have learned to make peace with the idea that leadership is messy, and that the right thing in the short term may look like a betrayal in the long term. I have learned that hope is almost always a series of tiny practical acts, teaching a young mechanic to anneal a pipe, hiding a jar of seeds, nursing a neighbor's dog back to health, rather than a single, cinematic rescue. The world continues to test us. The storms come and will come again. Red's hand still moves like rot, but the pump keeps running when it can, and the people who tend it have hands now calloused from routine and a stubbornness that feels like courage. When I walk past the cistern and see a child bending over to drink, I feel the ledger rebalance a little. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. At night, when the wind bangs the tarps and the generator hums like a quiet animal, I sometimes take out the tin where I keep photographs and hold a sun-faded face to my lips. I whisper the old sign-off into the dark, altered now. You're not alone. Keep your fires low, guard your water, and keep the people near. It is clunky, less broadcast than prayer, but it keeps me honest. We have a pump and we have a people. For now, that is enough to carve a margin of hope out of a world that keeps demanding arithmetic. The world does not end with a single thunderclap. It ends, if it does at all, in a long series of bad mornings stacked on top of each other. And in the small, stubborn mornings where people decide to do ordinary things again. We learned that lesson in the cold and the ice, with the pump clanking and the generator thrum under our feet. Survival isn't one big rescue. It's 1,000 small continuations. After Hearthwell, things were both better and not. We won clean water for a ring of communities, and that victory felt holy in its practicality. Babies stopped coughing so often. A clinic reopened. People planted seeds and found, to their amazement, that some things still wanted to live. We taught others how to backwash filters and how to hide a hand crank radio in a thermos. We buried spare ceramic membranes in a crate because we had learned the hard lesson of scarcity. Redundancy is humility made tangible. But the weather kept doing what weather does. Storms still came. Red's hand still prowls. Fuel still carries a price that sometimes requires moral accounting. The planet's slow mechanics, jet streams and ocean heat and feedback loops, do not care about our agreements or our ceremonies. There is no single antidote to the world's debts. There are only responses, iterative and often provisional. What changed, in a quieter way, was me. For years I thought my job was to be a voice that connected islands. That was true, but partial. The broadcast tethered people to one another, yes, but it did not, by itself, save throats or mend pipes. The pump taught me a more complicated truth. Connection and capacity must live together. Voice without infrastructure can comfort. Infrastructure without shared values can become a weapon. We needed both. I have learned to be a different kind of keeper. I still keep the air when I can, but I also teach. I show young hands how to solder a feed line that won't vibrate loose. I teach the rhythm of a backwash, the smell of a guilty bearing that needs replacement before it fails. I teach people to read the weather not as fate, but as a set of data points you can act on. Shadows over the west an hour before hail, the metallic pitch that signals updrafts, the way a barometer falls like a warning. These are not glamorous lessons. They are lifelines. Hope here is practical. It looks like a seed bank in a buried crate, like a rotation schedule for watch duty, like a training seminar in a repurposed conference room where someone draws diagrams on a milk crate. Hope is the small infrastructure of daily life. A spare belt, a jar of salt, a child who learns to cough without panic because they have seen a nurse heal someone. Hope is not certainty. It is a persistent allocation of resources toward a future you cannot guarantee. We made new rules, imperfect as they are. We trade water for labor, but we also insist on humane treatment. We bargain, but we also enforce minimal dignity. The covenant taught us the utility of record keeping. We taught them the necessity of mercy. Systems are not neutral. They are moral choices wearing bureaucratic clothes. If you build a pump, for example, you must also build a council that protects the most vulnerable, not just the most useful. That is a lesson we learn the hard way and keep relearning. There are nights I still think about the voices I left in the dark when I cut the transmitter. I think about the convoy that rolled and about the small faces that were not there when dawn came. Those losses are a permanent ledger. They live in me like a cold socket where a tooth used to be tender and not fully healed. But the ledger is also where I measure reason. Sometimes the smallest cruelty, silencing a broadcast for minutes, allows for a larger mercy. The math is never clean. So what do I tell someone who asks how to keep going? First, make redundancy a practice. If you have a pump, bury spare parts and hide a manual. If you have a radio, keep a hand crank in a thermos. If you have water, teach 3 people how to fix the pump and 2 more how to guard the intake without turning into oppressors. Second, barter knowledge as fiercely as you barter goods. A manual that teaches how to anneal a pipe is more valuable than a crate of beans once it keeps a line from freezing for a month. Third, build networks that are human-sized. A ring of 5 communities that must speak to function is easier to protect than a map you can't see. Fourth, teach the young and the curious. Skills transplanted across generations outlive any one life. And finally, keep your humanity. It is tempting to think that survival demands cruelty, that the world's scarcity must make us monsters. Sometimes survival does require hard choices, but cruelty corrodes trust faster than a hailstorm breaks glass. The people who last here longest are those who can still look a neighbor in the face and offer something more than calculation. A cup of water, a story, an apology. Those small acts of recognition are the muscles of civilization. Exercise them. I do not pretend to hold the final answer. I only hold a few small practices that have kept a ring of people alive through enough storms to make a map of the future seem possible. I'm a man who traded signal for a pump and learned that sometimes giving up the abstract saves the tangible. If there is a moral to it, it is this: be practical about hope. Build it the way you would a shelter, in layers redundantly, with a plan for each weakness. The night I write this, the pump sings under a sky that is not friendly but is, for now, tolerable. Children near the cistern are asleep in a way that does not sound like fear. In the quiet, I take out my tin of photographs and hold one up to the light. The face is bright with a younger me, hair not yet gray, eyes not yet lined by the weather. I kiss the corner of that photo as if I can press its warmth into the world. If you are listening, if somehow my voice finds you again across a broken net, here is what I want you to take. Keep your knowledge ready, bury your spares, train others, and do not mistake loud declarations for real change. Speak, but also build. Love, but also plan. We will keep imperfect ours. We will barter and fight and forgive and fail. We will lose people and gain children. We will steal moments of laughter between watch shifts and plant seed banks in the cracks. That is not a future of innocence, but it is a future with people in it. In the end, what I believe is small and stubborn. As long as a child can drink from a cistern without shame, as long as someone teaches another how to solder and how to read a sky, we have not been erased. Hope in this place is a practice. It is not a promise that the storms will stop. It is a choice to keep tending the fragile things that make life worth the keeping. This is Jonah Hale, signing off differently now. Not as a nightly voice across a wide dark, but as a man beside a pump, a teacher at a crude table, a keeper of small mercies. Keep your fires low, guard your water, teach another, and remember names. We are here, and that is, on a bad planet, a kind of triumph.